Hello, my name is Daniel Simon, and I'm the editor-in-chief of World Literature Today magazine here at the University of Oklahoma. And I'm with Amanda Cuellar, who is a PhD student in the English department. And would you like to tell us a little bit about your dissertation project and your background?
Sure. This is my 5th year at OU. I'm originally from El Paso, Texas, and my area of focus is Chicano literature. And right now I'm working on my dissertation, and I'm looking at Gloria Anzaldúa's theory about borderlands, but also expanding the lens through which I'm looking at her theoretical framework and looking at the spiritual activism behind her early writing and her later writing.
And we're here at the Returning Gift Conference, the 25th anniversary festival that's celebrating Native writers here at the University of Oklahoma since the 1992 conference was first held here. And I know on your committee you have Dr. Kimberly Blaeser and Dr. R.C. Davis-Indiano, who are both very involved in Native American studies and Chicano studies on campus. So we'd like to say hello to them and thank them for their support of this project. And we're also really celebrating the May issue of WLT, which featured many of the Native writers who are on campus this week. And we have in particular Ruby Hansen Murray, Kim Blaeser, Tiffany Midge, Linda Rodriguez, Aragon Starr, and Allison Hedge Koch, who will be with us today for some interviews where they're talking a little bit more about their work and what it means to them to be Native writers today. So without further ado, we'll get into the interviews.
Today I'm joined by Ruby Hansen Murray and Kimberly Blaeser. And Ruby Hansen Murray is Osage, and Kimberly Blaeser is Anishinaabe. And if you want to read more about their biographies, please look at the information box below the video. But we're going to get started with the interviews. And so I read both of your works in World Literature Today. I read Coyote Hunters and Captivity. And what I noticed between the two is that both of you involve themes of historical memory and intergenerational memory. I was wondering how you think that the role of remembering, both from a personal and collective perspective, shape your stories. So if you want to go first, Ruby?
Okay. Well, it's important to me what is erased, what's forgotten, what fades away as we tell stories over time. I've spent a long time working on a historical novel written in the 1820s, and I've read letters and journals, and those texts tell us a lot about how people saw the world. And I'm interested in telling stories that are truer to our family or to our cultural perspective. And I think that's really important. I think those voices are really important. And that brings me to the contemporary work that you have read that is doing the same thing, trying to tell our perspectives from where we stand and to give voice to the other kinds of nuances that influence those or are kind of embedded in the culture generally, but that we don't talk about.
So I love the idea that you said about working with what's been erased. Okay. Because when I think about my work, I think about the way that Paula and Alan used the term remembering as remembering to put back together. And I think in a lot of ways, especially my early work, I used to say these are memory poems. That was their job, because in many ways there is erasure of Native history. There was a failure to recognize the stories of Native people, and then there was just this real need for people to survive, and so that they did actually not have time to speak, to be heard, and so I feel like there's a recovery. It's an act of recovery. It's an act of remembering, putting that together. One of my early works is actually called Rituals of Memory, because I think for us, it's also a survival tool, that we need those stories, we need that history, and that it feeds us. So it becomes our calling to mind, and touching base with all of those things and bringing them forward is a way that we also make the world survivable for us as contemporary people.
Could I add one thing? Kim, I'm thinking about in addition to what's erased deliberately or just because of the worldview, I'm also thinking, like you say, about survivors and how it's too painful to have witnessed or survived. And so there's generations of stories that get lost because it's too painful to speak for a while. And so it really feels important to, like you say, remember, honor those stories, begin to talk about them, begin to come to terms with them in some way.
And part of that process of coming to terms with the past also involves identity building, I would say. So this question is for you, Kim. So in your poem, Kim, about captivity, I noticed that the theme of captivity is intricately tied to the notion of identity. So I was wondering if you see a relationship between these two?
I do, and I also link that back to what we were talking about the way that memory is so important to us because we become the stories we tell. We become the people and places of our past because our identity is made of them. I think it was John Le Carre who said, "We fight the wars we inherit." And in many ways, we are captive to our history, right? So I try to balance both the literal captivity of Native people in various historical moments, but also to think about the psychological captivity and metaphorical captivity in which we find ourselves. So if we think about the racial categories under which we are placed, for example, in various situations and how they count us in academies and so forth, right? And then there are all the sort of microaggressions, which are another kind of captivity. So I'm hyper conscious of that, but I'm also dedicated to the idea of liberation.
Ruby. So Ruby, your poem Coyote Hunters has the theme of identity threaded through it somewhat, and I was wondering if you could maybe talk about how identity plays a role not only in Coyote Hunters but in your other works.
Sure. I kind of think back to what Kim was saying, and in captivity, there's a phrase about ink and the bars of culture, cultural bars, and I'm really interested in the stories that we find written, and I'm really interested in writing my own stories, our own stories that address what else other worldviews when we live in the world. And I'd like to see, I sort of envision ink breadcrumbs for people to follow, Osage girls to follow, and our families, and to broaden the narrative and deepen it.
It reminds me what Linda Hogan wrote many years ago, is that we write for those who come after us and who've lived through our own story, who recognize in our story themselves, right? Yeah.
And in our stories, not only are people featured, but I think one interesting aspect of Coyote Hunters is your focus on animals. And so I was wondering if you could talk to us about how you see animals playing a role in your personal memory or collective memory as well.
Sure. What's funny is I didn't think of Coyote Hunters as about animals, actually. I was thinking about it as relating to family, so it was interesting. And I think how we view animals has a lot to do with the way we see the world or how we live in the world. And I grew up in the time of the deep-voiced male announcers, and there was one way to see the world, and they had it. And it was a culture that valued greed and exploitation. So, and in those years, we were taught that animals were only acted on instinct. They had no sentience, no feelings, and we saw something different. You see something different in your interactions in the world. And of course, today we have pet therapy animals who go to the hospitals, and they're there for staff as well as patients. And it interests me that our broader culture enshrines family values, but people don't live with family or with community. They live in smaller and smaller groups, where animals, pets, become elements of emotional sustenance. You know, people are talking to their pets, and their pets are their children. And so I'm really interested in us honoring animals and the world we live in, and acknowledging the importance of how we live together, and the importance of relating to other people, to be able to speak to people we live with them.
Well, it's also, you allude to this, but obviously we had clan animals, right, as tribal people, and that we look to these animals for ways to be in the world, like you suggested. I love that.
Both of you are photographers as well as writers. I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Can you both talk about the way that one art form influences the other in your creative process?
Sure. This is something that I'm actually really involved in now and kind of excited about, but I'm doing what I call, and I created this term, pictopoems. So they're basically layers of text and image. So I'm working out of a few different traditions. So one of them is obviously the pictograph, the Native American pictograph. But oftentimes they also had songs that went with them, right? It's the addition of a dream songs, for example. But then I'm also thinking about ledger art and the way that in ledger art there are these layers, and it's like a palimpsest where something is peeking out of something else. So I, for many years, was a wildlife nature photographer, and for many years have been a poet. And I suddenly started putting those things together, and sometimes ekphrastically, so just one interacting with another, so placing them together, but then you hope that when they come together, there's a third thing that comes out of that, right? I suddenly realized that in one instance, I was canoeing with my son. I took these lovely photos of a great blue heron flying through the sky, and it was a really amazing moment. But when I looked at the images, what I felt were not there, even though they were great shots, right? I knew that what I saw the clan animal. I saw the relationship that we have with animals in the world, the way we understand the natural world and tribal cultures. And so I thought, how could I make that image show that? So then, for example, I made woodland beadwork with sky. So now this great blue heron is flying through the woodland beadwork. And then I put pieces of language from a poem there, including Jashagi, which is its name in Anishinaabe. And sometimes the pieces have whole poems on them. Sometimes they have just pieces of language. So it's a project that I'm wildly engaged in right now.
Yeah. How about for you, Ruby? Do you see one form influencing the other in your creative process?
Well, I use poems and photographs as prompts sometimes, and I share my photos with a gifted poet, Brazilian poet, Lucia Liao, and we start writing from them and just go. So what I'm interested in my prose is creating moments, visceral, felt moments for the reader. And I think I'm really interested in how when you use a photograph in an essay, for example, that's not illustrative but associative, that the way we read, we change, we stop, there's just a shift. And so I think it really is a way to broaden the work. And I'm also interested and aware that in the electronic media we're used to now taking information in small bits of text with a photo. So I think fighting against that in a way, but it's interesting that that's part of how we're getting information now.
So do you write with other people? Is that part of your process where you?
Sometimes, yeah. It's and ekphrastic, just straight out associated, with a particular image, using an image as a start.
That's fascinating, since I think we tend to think of writing as a solitary process, but it is very communal.
Actually, for years I had a writing group, and we met in person and we shared work and everything, but then we did cyber haiku, where someone would post a haiku, so it was like interactive and then, interlinked. So someone would post a haiku and someone else, and we had haiku conversations, like literally for 12 years.
I would have been sad to see it.
Well, every so often we would start a new thread, but some of them were very artsy, poetic, and others of them were just drawing on like experiences of the day. It just became a really fun thing to do.
What types of
audiences do you hope to engage with each form? With visual, with the text? Do you see your process working in that way where audience is involved, or is it just a different sort of process?
I'm not sure. Yeah. I don't think I see a difference. Yeah.
How about you, Kimberly? Well, so in some ways I think so, because one of the things I've done also recently is I've begun to have exhibits of my work. So there'll be photos and then maybe accompanying poems, or there'll be examples of the picture poems. So I think you do draw someone different when you physically have it in front of you than those people who go to a page or the internet, right? So in some ways I think people have a different relationship with it. It may be the same people connecting in a different setting, but it's different to see an image on a page than to see it huge. Or I also think it's really important to perform our work, and I think that's probably where you hook and connect to a different audience, because people need the sound, particularly of poetry, but I think of writing in general. Like it's one voice reaching out to another, and it's sort of expressing in a way that it's the person who receives this, who creates from that what they will embed in their memory, right? So it's an interactive kind of thing, and so I think that in that way, especially, I was mentioning before about memory, and I wanted to give this little statistic that we have 2,500,000 megabytes of brain power. And so how do we use that in memory? And one of the things I did as Wisconsin Public Laureate is I had public recitations where people would come out and recite a poem, not their own. And that's another whole art. But the idea of committing it to voice, so it inhabits your body in a way, right? And you know it in a different way. So I think, the visual, the printed, the spoken are all drawing, touching us in different ways, and then linking to different audiences in a certain sort of way.
Well, those are all the questions I have for the two of you. We are so honored to have you here today, and thank you so much for interviewing the World Literature today. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, and also thank you for the beautiful issue.
It was wonderful.
Yes.
Beautiful. Thank you.